Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao Huang, Associate Professor of Social Sciences, and welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds Seminar Series. For today's seminar, we will open the floor to questions at the end at the talk. Today's speaker, Deng, a professor of urban and regional planning in Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. She also serves as the North American editor for the International Journal Housing Studies. She has been studying housing in both the US and China. Her research examines the different types of innovation the two countries have developed to ensure adequate housing and suitable living environments for their residents. In the US, the interventions she studied include major government housing programs as well as community-based initiatives. Her China research examines the evolving state and market relationship in shaping the country's housing system. She has published scholarly articles on these areas in top journals, such as the Journal of Planning Literature, Journal of Planning, Education and Research, and Housing Policy Debates. Her research has been funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Brick Industrial Association. She received her PhD in city and regional planning from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master and bachelor degrees in geography from Peking University, China. It's very excited to welcome Professor Deng.
Thank you, Professor Huang. So let me share my screen. So see, I'm sharing my screen and then let's say move back to the beginning. Okay. Is it working? Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good.
Well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let me minimize the panels. Okay, good. Yeah. So again, thanks to Professor Huang for inviting me to speak to Illinois Institute of Technology. So I'm very happy to be able to share some of my recent work. So this is co-authored work. So I've been working with Professor Silong Li from Chongqing University, and also Wei Canzhuo. She's a doctoral student in architecture in our program. And Yuan Han, he used to be our master student. Now he works as transportation planner in DC. So we are trying to look at the relationship between housing production and the structural transformation of China's real estate development industry. Okay, so let me make sure. Okay. So this is a brief outline of what I plan to speak today. And so basically, we first want to explain, why we become interested in this topic. And then we're going to look at some of the literature to see what do we know about the structure and the behavior of real estate development industry. And then we'll move to discuss about the issues in China. And in particular, we'll take a look at the a recent phenomenon that has taken place in China, which is a rapidly rising concentration in China's real estate development industry. So we're going to look at this issue first from industry-wide perspective to look at the industry as a whole, and then we're going to look at this at the local level, at the city level, to say, what the industry concentration looks like at the city level, and then how has that affected the local housing production. And finally, if we have time, so I would also like to discuss some of the implications of our research and before and after the pandemic. So why study China real estate development industry? So I think that for us, so the reason is straightforward. So there, as some of you know that, so China's real estate industry is a very hot topic. So it received a lot of attention, media attention, a lot of this discussion in industries. But surprisingly, there has been very, very limited scholarly research on the real estate development industry. So I will explain in a few minutes why that's the case. But in general, so we were surprised, and we believe that this lack of scholarship, lack of understanding about how the real estate development industry operates, it's a major gap in in the urban studies, right? Especially in the Chinese urban studies, a lot of Chinese urban studies look at the role of the government, but really I think the one major sector that has been the actors that have been producing China's rapid urban growth is the real estate development industry. So surprisingly, I think not many scholars have looked into this. So, but of course, at the same time, as I mentioned, that we all know that the real estate development industry is very important, right? So, and so this graph shows the amount of residential area that has been built in China. So, in the last 2 decades or so, and also its contribution to the GDP growth. So basically, you can see that since 2010, so I think China has been building around like 700 to 800 million square meters every year. If we look at the overall, production for all real estate space, so that was about like over 1 billion square meters every year. So which is kind of just incredible, right? The massive development that has been happening in the country, and also in terms of its contribution to the GDP growth. So you can see the housing development accounted for about 9 to 10% of the GDP growth since 2010. And by contrast, in comparison, so the housing development in the U.S. accounted for only about 3 to 4% of the GDP growth. So the real estate development industry is even more important for China than than the case in the U.S. or some of the other developed economies. But of course, at the same time, so we know that many of you probably have have heard about this from the media, right? There's a lot of coverage on this, that China's real estate development industry is really in trouble. So this is part of this was because of the pandemic. So in September 2020, Evergrande, Chinese known as Hengda Evergrande, which is one of the top 5 real estate development firms in China. So Evergrande was first reported in 2020 that it had trouble in paying back its debt, its overseas debt. And then, of course, things got worse. So in basically, in this August, so Evergrande, filed for bankruptcy in New York City. And as its founder and chairman was actually arrested, by the Chinese government for alleged business wrongdoing. And this is not an isolated case. So basically, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic has hit the Chinese real estate development industry very hard, through both like production disruptions due to the COVID lockdown and also the overall like weakening of the Chinese economy. So all these have have greatly affected the real estate industry and has caused widespread cash flow issues and pushing some of the Chinese news report pushing many real estate firms in China to the verge of bankruptcy. And the list of troubled real estate firms in China now include Country Garden, Biguiyuan. So Country Garden is the largest real estate development firms in China, and Country Garden has actually been producing about twice as much as what Evergrande has been producing. So Country Garden has also been reported to, having difficulty in paying its debt, even though right now it has, narrowly avoided, default. So I think the fact that the industry is in, such a big trouble, and so that also further shows the urgency for us to study, to try to understand, how the industry has been operating, right? How the industry has been organizing the housing production, and such knowledge can help assess the potential impacts of this crisis on both the industry and the broader Chinese economy. So I mentioned before that I think the scholarly research on China's real estate development industry has been very limited. So this is actually not just unique to China. So in general, I would argue that so the academic communities hasn't been paying a lot of attention to the real estate development industry. And part of the reason was, I'll explain in a minute. But because of that, because there hasn't been a lot of research on the Chinese real estate development industry, so we look to the international literature to say, okay, what do we know about how real estate industry can organize itself? So basically, I think one of the major reasons that the real estate industry tends to be understudied in many places, okay, not just in China, is because of the a widely held belief that the real estate development industry, especially the housing development industry, is a highly competitive sector. So it is a highly competitive sector, and it's decentralized, And so basically, this industry is believed that it has the ability to be able to respond to changes in market demand. So, whatever market demand change, and the industry can respond to it. So as a result, I think many people do not view the industry as kind of major issue of concern. So that's you can see some of this is a quote from a classic housing economics book on how in the traditional real estate economics literature, how the literature has been viewing the real estate development, the industry. So, however, I think, some of the, but there are some other scholars, outside the economics field. There are other scholars, mostly like from political science or from urban planning. So those scholars have, undertaken like some underground research, case studies of the behavior of the real estate development industry. And those scholars have been challenging this perception that the industry is highly decentralized, is competitive, and will be able to just to accommodate whatever the market demand. So instead, they argue that the developers are important agents on real estate market. They do not just passively react to changes in demand, but they may instead take actions to help shape the market. So that means we need to pay attention to their behaviors. And also, there are also scholars who argue that, the real estate development industry is not always competitive. There are cases where the industry could become concentrated. And if the real estate development industry become concentrated, and this concentration could have wide-ranging consequences on urban development and on the stability of the real estate market. So there are also a small number of empirical studies that try to measure, the industry organization, try to provide empirical measurement. So these studies have been undertaken, in different countries. So in the US, for example, Somerville finds that, in general, home building in the US is dominated by local and regional firms. And this is because in the US, we know that the local government system in the US is quite fragmented. And also the, local regulations for real estate development also tend to vary from place to place. So that has limited the level of concentration that is possible in the US. So, but at the same time, so I think the general consensus in the US is that the home building industry, it tends to be local and regional. But at the same time, British scholar Michael Ball, so he did several studies on this topic and looking at this issue across a few countries, mostly advanced economies. And he has found kind of considerable variations in how the real estate industry has organized itself, and which he attributes to the differences in economic needs that in those countries, and also the regulatory practices, because the regulatory system can be quite different in different countries. And also interestingly, Ann Hala, so she studied the real estate development industry in two Asian economies, Hong Kong and Singapore, and she argued that so in Hong Kong and Singapore, so there are large transnational real estate development companies, and those companies are very important for Hong Kong and Singapore's economies. So they occupy a significant share of those economies. But these kind of large transnational, real estate development companies are rare in the developed West. And her argument is that the reason this is the case, that they have these large transnational development companies, is because Hong Kong and Singapore have a public land ownership system, and this public land ownership system allocates land through auctioning system, the competitive auctioning, and which squeezed out developers' profits and forced them to search for new markets beyond their home base. But Hala did not provide only empirical test of this relationship. And as some of you know, that China also has a public land ownership system. So that's kind of similar to Hong Kong and Singapore. So in our research, we want to know, okay, to what degree that China's public land ownership system has also shaped how the real estate industry has been organized itself. And another takeaway from the literature is that all these studies have also identified the individual factors that are likely to affect the real estate industry organization. So those are the 4 factors that have often been identified in the literature. The nature of the housing production process, the availability of development inputs, and the risks on the housing market, and also the regulations, as I mentioned before. So in our research, so we are trying to say, okay, how these factors, play out in the Chinese context and how that has affected the organization of China's real estate development industry. So as I mentioned that I will first discuss this issue from the overall industry, industry-wide perspective, look at overall industrial changes, and then we'll look at this at the local level. So basically, as some of you know that, so the development of China's real estate development industry goes along with the country's efforts to build a market economy. So you can see this graph shows how rapidly so the industry has changed, right? Just, as shown by the number of real estate development firms and their ownership structure. So, if we add in all these different type of firms together, in 1999, this is kind of right before the takeoff of the real estate development industry, because in 1998, China had a major housing reform. So that major housing reform in 1998 abolished China's welfare housing system. So after 1998, so China has, kind of completely transitioned into like a market housing system, market housing industry. So that's how the real estate industry has grown so rapidly. So in 1999, there were only about like 25,000 real estate firms in China, so across the country. And the industry has employed fewer than 1 million workers. So by 2018, so China had about 100,000 real estate development firms employing about 3 million workers. So it's about 3 times, 4 times the size of what it was 2 decades ago. And also in terms of ownership structure, if you look at it, you can see that in 1999, so the state-owned real estate firms were very significant. So I think the graph shows the firms that are both state and collectively owned. But if you only look at the state-owned firms in 1999, so that those state-owned firms accounted for about like at least 30% of the total real estate firms. But then in 2018, so you can see that it's the share of state and also collective owned firms together, their share has become very minimum, right? So I think only about like less than 1% or so in 2018. But then almost the industry is completely dominated by private firms, right? So I think that's also very clear. So the expansion of the industry is driven by these private firms. But at the same time, so along with kind of the overall industry growth, so the China has also been seeing like a growing concentration of development activities among the country's largest real estate firms. So this look at the market shares based on the sales revenue. So this is the industry report shows that you can see that for the largest firms, that including both top 10 and also top 100 firms. So you can see this is very clear. So, even just, 2012, that's only about like a decade ago. So the top 100 real estate firms in China accounted for about 28% of the total market share, measured by sales revenue. And in 2018, so you can see that they almost occupied about 60% of the total sales revenue. And if you look at the curve, you can also see that kind of the pace of increase has actually accelerated since 2015. So the speed of increase was even faster after 2015. So the reason that this happening, that this this growing concentration of development activities among these large real estate firms was because of these firms have been expanding rapidly across the country. So this rapid geographic expansion. So this shows this is a study that look at again some of the largest firms, but they look at firms with sales revenue over 100 billion yuan. So those are kind of like equivalent to like top 30 firms in China. So you can see for those firms in 2003, those firms were on average building in about 5 cities. So the cities they were doing development was only kind of average of 5 cities. But then in 2008, so that number becomes 12 cities. And then, 2014, the average was doing business for among 40 cities. In 2017, so those firms were on average building across 80 cities. So it's kind of very, very fast, fast pace. And I think previously I mentioned about Evergrande. We can see, what was Evergrande situation, why the case was so significant, right? So the Evergrande, this is based on its 2018 report. So Evergrande, has been in 2018, Evergrande has been building across 228 cities in China with an annual construction of 72 million square meters in 2018. But if you think about this, just in 2009, which was only like 9 years earlier, so Evergrande was building in an average of 25 cities and with annual construction of only 1.2 million square meters. So this kind of the pace was really incredible, right? So the fast pace of spreading across the country, and that's kind of why when we look at, their overall, sales revenue, why those large firms have become so dominant in the industry. Of course, the next question is, what has been driving those processes, so why has this been the case? So I think to answer this question, we need to, look at the context of real estate development in China. As I mentioned, China launched economic reform, for more than 4 decades. And as a result of this reform, so we know that China has established what's called as a state capitalist system to organize its economy. So a prominent feature of China's state capitalist system is that while the economy has become predominantly market-driven, the state remains powerful and has control over key resources and key sectors. And in the case of real estate development, the state has control over the 2 most essential development inputs, land and capital, through a public land ownership system and also a state-run banking system. So this control have greatly affected how China's real estate development industry has been organizing itself. So I will explain this in greater details. So this graph shows the ways that we have identified how the supply of land in China has affected the real estate industry. And as I mentioned before, that China has a public land ownership system, right? All urban land is owned by the state, by the government, right? But as agents of the state, it's local governments who are in charge of assembling land and then sell the land to developers. So you can say this is, kind of a monopolistic supply of land, right? Because government was the only provider of urban land, right? And then the way that the local government sell land, so the local government sell land through an open land market. So where land is sold to the highest bidder, right? Which developer who offers the highest price, the land is, is this bidding process, right? Also through the auctioning process, like what Hong Kong has been using. So the developer who can offer the highest price will be able to get the land. But to promote this, fair bidding and also to prevent corruption, so the local governments are required to publicly release information on land availability and also release information on, the development perimeters, what can be built, right? What can development would be allowed in the land that is, under sale. So this is a kind of, this information is public, right? So this and the land happening, so this open, auctioning process. So this open land market system has greatly facilitated the expansion of real estate firms into new markets. So if you think about this, so because the information availability is so, so good, so the easy access of information allows development companies to identify and bid for development opportunities wherever they see fit. So it's very easy for outside firms to look at, the information is being published by the government to know, okay, this is how, how much land would be available, right? And then if they want to do development in the locality, then they'll bid for the land. And also because land was already assembled through government power, so the government already, they have already acquired the land from, the like rural farmers, and then, kind of convert them into like urban land. And then so the developers can just build, right? So they can build at a very fast pace. So we argue that this is, if you think about it, this is in direct contrast to countries with private land ownership system, like the US, for example. When you have a private land ownership system, so the land ownership tends to be fragmented, right? You have numerous, individual owners, right, of the land. And so if outside firm want to, enter a new market, so they often face like information barriers, right? You have to know, okay, who owns this land and who might be interested in selling the land. And also, if you want to do large-scale development, then you will have to work with these multiple landowners, right? Negotiate with them separately. So those are also kind of, challenges, very challenging process in the land assembly process. So all these, these barriers, information barriers, and also these practical challenges in land assembly, so that have often limited the level of concentration and integration in the real estate development industry in countries with private land ownership system. But of course, China is different, right? So this open land market really can help to, help facilitate so the process of expansion by those large firms, these outside firms entering new markets. But also another important consequence of this open land market system and of this auctioning process, this is the result. One of the very important consequence of this is a rapidly rising land cost, because land supply is very restricted. You only have one, one provider, right? The government, and the government often, has very, impose very strict, restrictions on how much land can be sold. So the land supply is highly restricted in China, and everybody has to bid for it. So as a result, so the land cost has risen very fast. From 2004 to 2018, the annual increase in land costs in China averaged about 17%. So land costs increased by 17% every year. By contrast, during the same time, so the average housing price increased only by 9%. So it's clear that the land cost has risen at a much faster pace than the housing price. And of course, so what that means is that profit margin for real estate development has actually been in decline for quite some time. So this declining profit margin, we can imagine that often has priced out many small development companies, right? Small firms, they just cannot put together those development deals. And also, this reduced profit margin also means that it is important to, to expand the volume of development, right? To compensate for the reduced profit margin. So that's kind of this focus on volume, right? On scale is also very important. But at the same time, of course, we also need to recognize that, the reason that these large real estate development companies in China chose to expand across all these, across the country, across all these different markets, is also a way for them to, as a way of, risk diversification, right, for risk management. Because, even though land is strictly controlled, there is still variations in local land supply schedule across places. Some places face more restrictions than others. And so as a result, if the real estate development companies want to sustain their development volume, so they have to, diversify. They have to go, to build across these different cities, just in case if one city become more restrictive, then they can still build in other places. So that's also very important incentive for them. But also on the supply of capital side, so certainly land play a very important role. But then, how, the capital supply is also very important for the real estate development in China, of course. So, and I think, one reason we also argue that the reason that China's largest real estate development firm have been able to expand, so rapidly across the country is also a result of the advantages they enjoy in the access to low-cost capital. So in China, all major banks are state-owned. And, when the banks are owned by the state, so they have the backing of the state. So what that means that the banks can raise capital at a fairly low rate. So, the banks in China have been paying no interest rate to, households, savings account, right? So the money was raised at a low cost, but of course, that also means that the banks can provide loans also had a low cost, right? So whoever can get loans from the bank, so, that will be a great kind of service for them. But the bank's ability to lend is also heavily regulated by the central government. So the Chinese central government has long been concerned about the economy's dependence on real estate development, has often kind of tightly regulated banks' ability to lend to real estate development projects. So studies have shown that only developers that were assessed at low risk can obtain bank loans. And of course, those are the developers who are, those are the large developers that have direct or indirect ties to the state. So only those large developers can get those low-cost bank loans. And of course, as we know, Chinese developers has also been getting money, capital from many other sources, right, including like overseas, debt, right, issuing bonds, those way. But in general, I think those other non-bank funding come at a much higher cost. But these large developers, when they have, the relationship with the government, so they can often, obtain these low-cost loans from the banks. But at the same time, so I think some of you may also know that, so the, a very unique feature of China's real estate development is the extensive use of the pre-sale business model. So the pre-sale practice in China is unique in the sense that the funds raised through pre-sales, and these funds include both, home buyers' down payment as well as the mortgages they take out from the banks. So the home buyers have to take out the mortgages from, from banks, and in order to purchase, pre-purchase those units. So all this money, both down payment and mortgages, those money were given to developers during the development process, and then the developers can use this money as development capital. So what this means that then developer didn't have to put a lot of their own money, so that real estate development in China is highly leveraged. But developers need to deliver those housing units as quickly as possible, right? Because people already paid for them; they pay the full price to purchase those units. So as a result, chasing the speed and volume of development has become essential for Chinese real estate development firms. So which of course again favors those large development companies with greater organizational capacity. So this is kind of a rough comparison between China and the US in terms of the industry concentration. So, if we look at the overall development magnitude, housing production in the US was only about a quarter of what China has been producing in the last decade. But if we look at, the industry, measure about the market share, taken by the top 5 companies, right, in both countries. So you can see that in the US, so the top 5 home builders in the US accounted for about 13% of the country's total housing production. But in China, the top 5 real estate firms account for, 30% of the country's total real estate production. So, what this means that not only China as a whole has been building far more housing than the US, but a greater share of its production was delivered by the country's largest real estate development firms, as I have shown before, so that we were trying to explain why that has been the case. So basically, I think our industry-wide analysis shows that while the rapidly rising concentration of China's real estate development industry is largely like a market-driven process, right? Those are market behaviors, right? Firms expand, right? So when they have the capacity to do so, they expand. So there's less new about this. But what we want to emphasize is that this process is facilitated and is shaped by China's unique institutional environment. In particular, as we argued, is a state control of both capital and land. So that's can help us explain about this China speed, right? This expansion across these many cities across the country. But what is not clear is how these processes have taken place at the local level. So we do not know, for example, whether local housing production has also become concentrated among large firms, and also what factors have driven the firm's decision on how much to produce in a particular local housing market. So that's what the second part of our analysis is about. So because, as you probably can see that because it's very difficult to get data about the production volume of every individual firm, right? This kind of data set is just not available. So fortunately, so what we have been doing is that we have been using a unique data set published by China Real Estate Statistics Yearbooks. So the real estate yearbooks, so they publish the overall housing production by different type of real estate firms for 35 major Chinese cities. So basically, so in every city, so the local governments will assign accreditation, so the different accreditations to local real estate development firms that have been building in their jurisdiction. So they look at, how long the firms have been building there, and they look at their, how much space they have built, right, their development records, and then they'll assign them into these different categories, accreditation categories. So as you can see that, so this just based on, the criteria showing there. So you can say it's very clear that the first grade firms are often like viewed as, the largest local housing producer, right? The first, grade firms are firms that have been producing, far more housing than the other, groups of firms. So the first grade firms can be viewed as kind of the largest housing producers, even though we do not know, how much each individual firm has produced, but the data set does tell us about collectively how much housing has been produced by all the first grade firms in each city, in each locality. So we put this data together. So we compile the data together from 2005 to 2018 for 35, major Chinese cities. And then we look at 3 indicators to measure local industry concentration. So the indicator include first the number of first grade firm in each city, right? What is it? How many firms, are qualified as first grade firm every year? So we look at, the total number of these large producers. And then what is the total number of housing units produced by those first grade firms in each city in a given year? And then we look at the share, right, in terms of percentage. What is the share of the total housing units produced by, all the first grade firms in a particular city? So we can first look at kind of the average picture, right, for the presence of these large producers, these first grade firms. So this basically shows that, if we look just at average value, so the 3, we look at, 3, you can see three variables here, right? The first is actually, the orange bar shows the total number of registered real estate firms, the average number of registered real estate firms across all the 35 cities during this time period. And, so you can see that, because, this data set look at all the 35 major cities, and these cities are located across the, the entire country, but they are major cities, so they are big cities. So that's why you can see that, these cities have a large number of registered real estate firms, right? So basically you can see the number range from, 700, 800 to up to 1,000. But then among these large, of course, not every firm has been producing every year, and not every firm produces a lot, right? So among all these firms, now if we look at, okay, how many of them were identified as first grade firms? So you can see that the average number of first grade firms is actually very small. So it's a blue bar. You can see it's very minimum, right? Almost invisible. So the average number of the first grade firms is actually, I think, ranges between 10 to 20 firms per city in a given year. So it's very, kind of very small number. But also in terms of the housing, the total housing they have produced, so the share of housing they have produced as a group. So you can see that the average share of housing units produced by their first grade firm is also pretty low, right? Ranging from 7% to 11%. So it's, overall, you can say, the picture is pretty clear that at least on average, so the local housing production remain to be fairly decentralized, right? So that's kind of the overall message takeaway we can get from this picture. But at the same time, when we look at the data set, there is a lot of variations from city to city in terms of the presence of these first grade firms and how many housing units they have built. So because of these variations, so we want to look into take advantage of these variations to say, okay, can we identify the factors that have affected the likelihood for the city to have first grade firms, and how much housing those first grade firms have produced. So that's kind of our city level empirical analysis. So we want to identify what are the factors that have affected the local housing production and the level of industry concentration. So we have this panel data set. So as I mentioned, and we run a simple fixed effects panel data model. And so our, this part of analysis is actually pretty straightforward. So the way that we try to identify is we want to identify what are the factors that are affecting how much firms chose to build in a particular place. So these are the factors that we expect that should have played some role. Certainly the strength of local demand, right? Local housing demand, so that would attract firms to build in the locality. But then, of course, the cost of development, so that will limit how much they can do. But we also believe that the land availability itself even the land cost is part of the, development cost. So we expect that to affect, how much housing can be built, and, whether firms can build more to be qualified as first grade firm. But we also expect that the land availability itself, the land area available, can also have some additional impacts. And that's because in China, the supply of land is not just a response to the demand for land, right? So land is not supplied just simply because more people or more developers are willing to pay for it. So the land supply in China, the total amount of land supply is determined through the administrative planning process, right? The government, has developed the land use plan and determine, how much land should be supplied every year. And so, this plan does not just consider about economic demand, it also consider many other factors. So that's why we believe that, the land factor, the land supply should also, we expect it to may have some additional impacts on the local housing production decision. So based on this simple framework, so we kind of create this kind of panel data model. So we look at the kind of 3 models, and I put the kind of results there. So for the 3 indicators I mentioned before about the number of first grade firms, the total housing produced by the first grade firms, and the share of total housing produced by those firms. So we look at the impacts of these independent variables. So what we have seen is that, whether this table shows whether the relationship is positive or negative, and whether it is, statistically significant. So basically, just to summarize the findings, what we have found from this city level analysis is that, this is what the table what the table I presented that has told us. So the table shows that cities with strong housing demand are more likely to see the presence of large producers than those with weak demand, right? So if a city is with strong housing demand, population growth, economic growth, then you are more likely to see, the number of, large, first grade firms, okay? But then what we have found that these large producers do not necessarily account for larger share of total local housing production. So what this means that, place with strong demand, this strong demand, economic growth, population growth, also offer opportunities for some of the smaller firms. So as a result, so even though those places are more likely to see large firms, but those large firms do not necessarily dominant in the local housing markets. But also more importantly, so our model has consistently, we run the 3 models and has consistently showing that the cost of land has a strong negative effect, statistically significant, very strong negative effects on the presence of large producers and the share of housing that they have produced. So basically, the rising land costs, discourage firms from building more. So that means fewer firms can be qualified as first grade firms, and also, also reduce the share of housing being produced by those first grade firms. So after controlling for demand and the land cost, and we find that just the availability of land itself does not prompt more local housing production. So which is understandable, because if we think about, again, firms' production, decisions, firms will only build when they have profit to be made, right? They expect, they can make a profit. So what that means that, so once we have control for housing demand and control for cost, so that, where the their profitability is determined. So the availability of land itself does not necessarily prompt firms to build more. So that's kind of what the empirical models have told us. So just to summarize, to summarize together what we have, what we have identified from both our industry-wide analysis about the rapidly growing concentration industry-wide, as well as the city-level analysis. So, this is what, the arguments we have made before, that China was seeing a growing concentration in its real estate development industry prior to the pandemic, a result of its unique institutional environment, in particular the state control of land and capital supply. However, our city-level analysis shows that local housing production remains largely decentralized, thanks to the, to a large degree, thanks to the rapidly rising land cost. So that discourages the local industry concentration. So this gives rise to an interesting phenomenon in Chinese real estate development, that is the rapidly rising industry-wide concentration has taken place alongside a decentralized local housing production structure in those major Chinese cities. So the industry is vertically integrated, but kind of horizontally spreading out. But then, of course, that leaves us with a question is, why didn't China's large real estate firms, why did they choose to expand, across markets, expand horizontally, and rather than just secure, maybe deepening their presence in a smaller number of markets and secure a more dominant position in particular local housing markets. So our argument, our explanation is that, so to understand this issue, so we argue that we need to look at the relationship between the real estate development industry and the Chinese state, right? The Chinese government. And if you think about, we talk about China has a state cabinet system. So what that means is that, for the real estate development industry, for the real estate development firms, regardless how large and how powerful they are, when they, when we compare them with the power of the state, they're always at a disadvantaged position because the land supply, is strictly controlled by the state, by the Chinese government. So, what that means that, so even if some of these firms, even if they chose to build more, in a particular housing market, and they chose to kind of build up their market power, but that really doesn't give them much advantage because the land supply is still controlled by the government. So if the government, decide to, at some time significantly reduce the land supply, then, then these companies will not be able to build much, right? So it's kind of will be a major blow to them. So what that means, so there is so much risk associated with the, the kind of the supply of land, so much uncertainty. So that's, as a result, if the real estate firms, if they concentrate their investment, their business in a small number of cities, so that actually would put them into a very risky and vulnerable position. So that's why instead of focusing on kind of smaller number of markets, and most of, almost every large real estate firm in China has chosen to expand horizontally to diversify their risk. And because just, increasing their market presence in a single market does not really give them a lot of market power, again, given that they did not have control on how much land they would be able to get. So some of the implications. So basically, so yeah, I think I'll be very quick. So talk about, so we, thinking about our research findings and also thinking about what is going on in China these days. So I think we argue that, so our research can provide, kind of insights in 3 areas. So the first is that our research can help explain the public and government responses to the rising industry concentration. So the rapidly rising industry, rapidly rising concentration in China real estate development industry is a highly visible phenomenon. Many people were talking about, industry reports were documenting it. However, if we look at the responses to this phenomenon, these changes, at least before the pandemic, so almost all the responses were focusing on very much kind of emphasizing the benefits of the rising industry concentration, the consumer cost saving, kind of the economy of scale, and, can improve the development standards, with very little discussion about, wait a minute, maybe, this rapidly rising concentration is something we need to worry about, thinking about the too big to fail, thinking about whether, some of the, other, market manipulation, those kind of issues. But no, there was very little discussion on this. And so I think the reason for that, in our view, is that based on research, is that because, from as our research has revealed that even though the industry overall has become more concentrated, but when you look at this housing production at the local level, the housing production is still very decentralized, right? So I think the issue about market manipulation, about those kind of, market power, that does not seem to be a concern. People do not see those as an issue because, again, at the local level, so it still remains to be a decentralized competitive process. So that's kind of how we believe our finding can help explain this. And the second area is that in China, recent studies have often identified that, China has, Chinese housing market suffers from what's known as a regional housing imbalance. So what this means, that regional housing imbalance, is that in China, some of the first tier cities, superstar cities like Shanghai and Beijing, so those places have very high housing price, very strong housing demand. But exactly those places that actually the housing production, new housing production, is very limited. It's insufficient. So this kind of the very undersupply of housing, so has actually exacerbated this housing affordability problem in those places. But at the same time, so we know that in some of the other cities, like the less developed cities, some of third-tier cities, kind of, these less developed regions. So those cities were actually, we actually saw more housing production in those places. And this excessive housing production has often led to like high vacancy rate and the widely documented ghost town phenomenon, right? Some of you are aware of this. So I think in explaining those regional housing imbalance, previous studies have often emphasized about, this is the result of the distorted land supply system in China, right? Which is true. So they talk about some of how, the government supply of land has not been enough in meeting housing demand in area of strong economic growth. So that is the case. However, we argue that our study also provide evidence, kind of highlight the role that real estate development industry has played in producing this outcome. Exactly like we have identified, there is this selective relationship between housing production, selective relationship between land cost and local industry concentration. So what that means that it is in places of lower land cost, we are more likely, or data also show that in places of lower land cost, we were more likely to see the presence of large producers, more first-grade firms, and the first-grade firm also occupy a larger share of the housing production. So what this means that when in those places with low land cost, so it is clear that these large producers have more market power, and that also means that they are more likely to overbuild. So that cause the housing oversupply that I just mentioned, as shown by some of the identified as a ghost town phenomenon. And last, so we also argue that so our study also raised an important issue about how should we view the real estate development process, in China, as now as we've seen that in so many places, so the real estate development happens because of the, under the control of this, the country's largest real estate development firms, right? So what that means that, real estate development in China in many places has become less and less of a local business, right? Because the capital, outside of firms, they invest, capital in the local markets, and they build housing, they sell housing, and they made a profit. And then the revenue, the profit, the revenue, the money would be sent back to the company headquarters for reinvestment. So that's kind of the, the mobility of the capital. So what that, in some way you could argue that this may actually be drawing wealth away from some of the less developed, regions. But at the same time, so then when markets turn into elective, right, as what we are seeing today, after the pandemic, right, so the real estate, many of the firms are in trouble. So they cannot continue with their aggressive expansion strategy. So many of them are withdrawing from, many of them are withdrawing very quickly actually from some of those less developed cities, smaller cities. And as a result, what we are seeing today is that there are many unfinished projects in those places, right? In those kind of, the less developed regions, because those places are less attractive. The demand has become so weak. And so that's kind of, what we have been seeing that, there are unfinished projects in those places. And also, the significant decline in real estate development activities in those places. And also significant drop in the land sales revenue for the local governments. So which pose a lot of challenges for the local governments, especially given that many of the local governments have, backed, the debt, the municipal debt. I mean, so that there are many during the real estate boom. So, there are many local governments issued the municipal debt that are backed by the land sales revenue. So when the land sales revenue has dropped significantly, so that's also affecting the safety. The local governments may not have the money to pay back those loans, right? The government loans, government debt. So that would have, kind of great impacts on those, on the safety of the debt, and also, on the overall economy, in China. So I will finish there, and then I take some questions. Sorry, I spoke too much. So let me see. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Professor. Gave an excellent talk about how actually the real estate development actually will affect the economy in China in general, and in terms of the labor and also the capital and also the land. So Currently, we take the questions. So I think that your results is very interesting. So to see actually, it's the higher demand actually will be actually have the more the large share, but have the more large producers presence, but
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily they are share. So which means that they participate in this process, but actually they may not put the large investment in these
Mm-hmm.
areas.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also that make me think linked to your table about compare China and the US, like China's top five actually accounted for 30%, but for US it's only like 13%, is
Mm-hmm.
less than 15%.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you see like in China's this? It seems it's very kind of common for China's large companies. Actually, they participate in different cities.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, but actually they may not have this large investment in each places. So how did you see actually they are do you think actually they just try to make a profit from this because they can actually, as you said, they can get the low cost land um,
Mm-hmm.
because of their large companies, they have more
Mm-hmm.
market power
Mm-hmm.
to actually make a profit from these different cities instead of
Mm-hmm.
actually benefit the local economy.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind
Mm-hmm.
of take advantage of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's a good question. Yeah, so I think basically the strategies that the large real estate firm in China have been pursuing is to expand, right? Is to try to, try to build in as many places as possible, but not necessarily occupy a significant market share in each of them, right? Just as a way of reducing the risk, right?
Mm.
Especially given that, the land is controlled by the government, right? So that's kind of the overall strategy. But that does raise issue, I think that make me we were concerned. We started this research actually before the pandemic, and we actually started this in 2018. So at that time, we did some interview with some real estate developers. So we asked them about, kind of, yes, so, when they were, even when these companies were building in some of these smaller cities, less developed regions, and as I mentioned, so the profits, the revenue they have made, they're selling housing, right? So that local house, residents paid to purchase housing, but all their profits, they have very strict capital control. So all their profits that were made in those localities were sent back to the company's headquarters. And then the company then decide how to reinvest the money. So the revenue the profit did not stay locally, unlike the traditional real estate development project when real estate, used to be, I mean, in US, in many places, real estate is still very local. But of course, this is also changing, but not as much as what's changing in China. So when real estate development is local, then the developers, will be very much focused on building local relationship, right? And also, the profits, these a lot, large portion of the profit would also stay local for reinvestment, right? For continue to expand development locally. So I think that is a big issue. So that we talking about in China, like I mentioned about like, kind of like how to the wealth has actually been kind of been taken away, so in that sense, but also kind of now when they withdraw themselves from those places, and so that these are quickly put this economy under kind of risk, right? So this kind of volatility of the local economy, so that moved so quickly, like when there was real estate boom, everyone entered into a locality and built, and then when the market is turning negative, and then these companies quickly withdraw themselves, they don't have any local ties. So that's kind of the economy become very volatile. So I think that's kind of a big issue to think about. So that even real estate development have become in some way like footloose, right? We talk
Mhm.
about other industry have become footloose, manufacturing industry have become footloose, right? All these jobs were moving away, but now I think like even the people used to think in the US that, at least the real estate, real estate developers, we argue in the US, real estate developer play a very important role in local politics. That's because, they have this local relationship. They want to continue to build their local relationship. But that's not the case in China, right? So that's, it's all these outside firms that are building, and then they come in and then they go. So that's a major issue. And especially given that so many local economies depend so much on the real estate development activities. So yeah, I think that's something that's why we are arguing that we really need to think about these broader implications of this industry organization and industrial behaviors. All these are not just pure market behaviors, right? They are shaped by policies, by, by the institutional environment, and they have, serious consequences.
So did also these larger companies, they also participate, and did you see they also participate in those like housing affordable housing programs? So how actually they are present actually factor this housing affordability
Yeah.
local?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends. I think a lot of places, especially the places where the local governments have more leverage, mostly like, in some of the cities with strong demand where everybody wants to build. So where the local governments have been, requiring some, real estate developers, okay, if you want to, purchase land from me, then, you'd better, like inclusionary housing, like what we see in the US. So some local government China has also been requiring the real estate developers to maybe having a certain percentage of their housing being designated as affordable housing, and often these affordable housing units, after they were built, so they will be transferred to the local government, so they will help manage them. So that's kind of, especially like Shenzhen, which is kind of, and some of the very large cities, right? Those cities where, that they could ask developers to do that. But then again, it's in these less developed, cities and smaller cities where the local government didn't have that much leverage. They just, they welcome every development, right? Of course, the more development, the better, because they didn't have any other economic drivers. So in that case, they cannot impose, additional requirements on this, because otherwise the developers won't come. Which is actually the same like in the US, where, only places that hot markets, right, tighter markets, that those places are more likely to impose this requirement of like inclusionary housing, or ask developers to contribute or make some contribution to affordable housing funds, but not in, some places that, may have been seeing like a soft housing markets or oversupply of housing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So which means large or attractive cities or places, they are have more power or leverage. So
Yeah.
the other thing I find interesting is for your results for the land. So for the land cost, for the land cost actually have a negative impact on the presence of large producers. So which means it's low cost, then will be see more
Yes.
large producers, which makes sense because they have more power to actually get those low cost
Exactly.
land. But if in the other direction, actually it's which means if you have a high land cost, will be have the low presence of these large producers. But if in that case, which means um, how these like small producers, they can afford like the high cost
Yeah,
land.
that's a good question. It's actually not small developer. It's actually just, every, so we have example in the paper talk about the situation in Beijing. So if you look at the land sales, so the land sales, almost all the land sales went to those large developers, only large developers, because the land cost is so high, right? So
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
yeah, only the large developers were able to purchase land. But then if you look at how much housing they are able to build, each of them, the amount of housing they can build is actually very small. So basically, because first of all, the land cost is very high, so they cannot purchase a large amount of land, right? And also kind of this increased competition among the developers. So yeah, even though the land sales may be dominated by large developers. But when you look at the market share each developer can occupy, that in terms of housing production, it's actually kind of very limited. So the number of housing units they can build is very limited. And also because remember, I think the way that the first grade firms were identified, so that's based on the number of, the amount of, space being built. So that's the same criteria across the country. So just simply the fact that in those very expensive cities, so developers were not able to build a large number of housing units in general. So that also kind of reduce the number of firms that could be qualified as first grade firms. You see my point? So basically, so just because the overall supply of land is so limited in Beijing and in Shanghai, so that the overall development magnitude for each of the firm also tends to be, become less and less over time. So that's why fewer firms, in more recent years, fewer firms can qualify as first grade firms. And of course, then their total housing production also count for smaller share.
So which means actually it's only these large producers, they can actually get those land from
Yeah, they
these.
can get land because they can only those companies can afford to purchase the land, but still the amount of land they can get is limited, and the total amount of space they can produce has become more and more limited over time.
Okay, so it's that also the case that, because just now you said that even the get the land is large, but the main their production is still actually the
Very limited, yeah.
limited. So it's also because they actually some large producers, they get the land, but actually they resell or contract to other
It could be,
company.
yeah. So there has also one thing we noted as kind of one of the limitations for our research is actually because of the land costs have become so high in China, especially in those large cities. So a lot of the development companies actually have actually started to collaborate with each other. So, they kind of sometimes they put funding together, and sometimes they collaborate. Maybe one company put money there, and the other company, contribute their expertise or those kind of things. So they have actually increased their collaboration. And as a way, first of all, then they will have greater capacity, right, if we work with each other. And second, when they work with each other, so that also reduces the competition between them, kind of help, help reduce the increase in land cost. Right. Remember, the reason land costs are rising so fast is because everybody compete with each other, right? They bid for the land. So that's kind of, this negative, kind of this negative effect as a result of competition. And now, the land cost becomes so high, and developer realize, okay, well, we'd better work with each other rather than compete with each other, so that we can, help mitigate this increase in land price. And so that's also kind of interesting as a way. And so, some that going forward. So when we look at the housing production, sometimes the housing units may have been built by multiple companies together. So they may, some may contribute like 70% of the kind of the resources, and the other contribute 30% of resources. So that's kind of, yeah. So in the future, I think measuring the market share will get even more complicated because of this collaboration, because companies are, not every company collaborate, but there has been, kind of this phenomenon, kind of some firms have started to collaborate with each other, so that kind of also, and yeah, they're no longer kind of independent, competitors with each other. Yeah, so there are a lot of responses. I think I think the reason we want to do this research is to say how, this development industry, these market actors respond to, all these relationship, the state market relationship, right? So these how market behaviors, the behaviors and the organizational forms they have developed or they have undertaken, so very much respond to the state control over both land and, as I mentioned, also capital. So that's, we want to see this kind of dynamic relationship between the industry and the government, because we feel that a lot of the research in Chinese urban and housing research has been almost overwhelming, focused on understanding the government role, but not many, not much work at really looking at. Let's look at some of the market actors, right? Look at this kind of what's going on, how private sector responds to those. So we feel that's kind of important to study.
Yeah, definitely. So especially when actually it's currently the China's real estate marketization is all privatization of housing
Mm-hmm.
development is already been decades. So
Mm-hmm.
it's as you said, actually the developers are responding very differently.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder when you look at like these 35 major cities, actually, they have like large cities, like the first um we have say first tier cities like you mentioned the Beijing is
Mm-hmm.
they have a very limited land actually,
Mm-hmm.
so that's
Mm-hmm.
how have a high competition for this land. But how actually these developers they responding actually they move their capital as you mentioned like mobility the last
Mm-hmm.
challenge of mobility of the capital they move from these first tier cities to maybe second tier cities,
Mm-hmm.
how actually you see they are responding to this government policy, governments actually they providing they have different land supply
Mm-hmm.
policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's kind of what we argue, also going back to kind of some of other international scholars have been arguing that, developers are not just passive agents, right? They do not just passively react. They do take actions, proactive actions to respond to, these government regulations, right? These kind of, increased government control. And I think so what we have seen is that during the boom time, right? So as I have shown that the companies expand very fast, right? They move into these, smaller cities, third tier, second tier cities. But now we are seeing, okay, they're also withdrawing themselves, right? So I think they have really, I think now if you look at today's land sales records, a lot of these companies they're only purchasing land in the first tier city. Not only, but most of most of them are only interested in purchasing land in those first tier cities because they believe, the strength is still there. The market strength is still there for those large cities, right? And they have pretty much given up on some of the smaller cities. So that's, again, so this kind of quick movement of capital. So that has a lot of impact. Yeah. So that's, yeah. So how the strategic behaviors and what they have chosen to do. And it's, it's not neutral, even though these are market behavior, but they're not neutral, right? They have significant impacts on localities. Mm.
Yeah, but from the planning perspective, it's kind of when these large cities become more larger and larger, it's kind of too large. So
Mhm.
and so how actually the second tier city or the small cities actually the government they can respond to actually attract more real estate investor there to instead of all the persons or all the investments just pour into these large cities
Mhm.
that actually there has a very limited land actually
Mhm. Yeah.
is there.
Yeah, well, that depends on whether, I think it really depends on whether these smaller and less developed cities, whether they have demand, right? If developers, the economy, the overall economy has, is weakening, so the demand has, dried up in many places. So, and if there's no real demand, then of course developers are not going to build there. I think so. So if they want to, I think we're talking about like how can we like encourage more population growth in the smaller city, less developed cities, right? Because the large city are already too large. But I think the question is, do people want to live there, right? Are there opportunities, right? And I think also, can that from developers' perspective is if they build, are they able to sell, right? And at what price? So if there is no real demand, if there are no the reason, there's still everybody favor large city, but large cities offer so much more. Large cities where the government institutions are located, right? Is where they can all the education opportunities, jobs are. And this so that's kind of yeah, this disparity. I think China, one reason or argument we also made that is this rapid, this rapid space expansion has also contributed to the rise in regional disparities in the sense of some of the wealth may have been drawn away from some of the less developed regions.
Yeah, let's develop the region. But I'm saying is like these largest cities, especially like Beijing, Shanghai. like Shenzhen, these
Mm-hmm.
larger cities. It seems to still see actually in there's the people they actually move back
Mm-hmm.
to original their
Yeah.
home cities, because a lot of what they actually is moved to this larger city after their
Yeah,
like
they could.
college.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then the the last question is, how did you see like this industrial concentration actually is could be related to the housing affordability, for this variation actually for different places. So which means it's better we always have this um, larger producers present, or actually it depends on different places to contribute to housing affordability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think to improve housing affordability, it still needs government support. Right. So again, no developers will just build affordable housing by themselves, right? So,
Mhm.
I think that's why I said, in places where price is not high, developer cannot make, significant profit. They are not gonna provide affordable housing by themselves. So very much it's up to the government whether the government is determined to be able to provide support, such as, providing land specifically for affordable housing development, right? Or, kind of reducing some of the kind of land cost, right? And some of the other, provide maybe infrastructure to help facilitate, these affordable housing develop. So I think fundamentally to address housing affordability crisis, it still very much, depends on, you know, how much the government is willing to invest in those areas. And this is the same case in the US, right? So, it's not something that will be solved by the industry, the development industry, the developer, right? They are profit driven, right? The
Exactly.
rational behavior, but then the affordable housing needs subsidy, needs support.
Okay. Yeah, that's makes sense. It's still depends on government their roles
Mm-hmm.
for this um housing affordability. So so thank you so much
Mm-hmm.
for giving this great talk. So to help understand the China's real estate development and how actually affect the broader economy.
Mm-hmm.
So usually we give a plus to
Okay.
because at the end. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for the great questions. Okay. Okay. Bye. Maybe I'll see you at some